Hi everyone, so we're going to take you now through chapter 1, which is Understanding Psychology, which is essentially your textbook. So those of you who have purchased a textbook, you'll recognize what this looks like, and this will probably all make sense to you, and those of you who are not going to, this is the textbook that we have for the course. It's The Signs of Who We Are by Charlton Sobel and Sobel. So the question that you might want to ask yourself in this course is, what is psychology? And it's been defined in your textbook as the scientific study of the behavior of individual organisms and how environmental, physiological, mental, social, and cultural events influence these behaviors. And there's three main characteristics of psychology. Number one, it is a science, and it studies individuals' behavior, the behavior of individuals, and finally it studies the variables that influence this behavior, i.e. the environmental, physiological, mental, and social interactions and cultural practices. So in terms of the dynamics between past and future researches, psychological scientists, they conduct the research, they develop the theories, then they publish reports, and then these reports, the psychological practitioners use these reports in their work, and then they basically come up with new problems and questions, which they then pose, which goes back to the scientists who develop the theories and conduct the research. And it's a dynamic that goes back and forth. So when we talk about anthropomorphization, this is when we project the experience of humans and abilities onto non-human objects. You can see in the picture here we're talking about animals. So it is a study of the individual, and psychologists are interested in how an individual behaves, even when the individual is part of a social group. And these are the 5 things that influence psychology, as we mentioned before, right? So we talked about physiological, environmental, cultural, mental, and social. And this test of what psychology is essentially psychology is a behavior that anything a dead person cannot do, right? So I can eat junk food versus I will eat healthy food. The dead person tests cannot be done by a dead person, right? These things: running, walking, raising hands, sleeping, eating fruits and vegetables. Things that cannot be done by a dead person. So this passes the dead person test. But what fails a dead person's test are things like not eating foods, not talking in class, lying on the ground, right? These are things that can be done by a dead person. And in terms of behavior, these are 2 major dimensions of behavior: complex versus simple, and internal versus external. And we'll be looking at all these kinds of behavior in psychology. And there are some major perspectives of psychology, and some of those will be considered in the video that I'm about to play. So let's get to it.
He knows a lot about the science stuff, Professor Dave explains.
If we are going to learn psychology, we actually have to start with a little bit of history first. Now, you may be wondering why a psychology series is starting with a history lesson. Well, it turns out that what we consider to be psychology today is very different than what was considered to be psychology in the past. We will be focusing mainly on modern psychology in this series, but knowing the history of psychology will give us a better understanding of the influences that shaped psychology into the field of study that it is today. It will also give us an idea of how psychologists, both past and present, think about the mind and how it works. In knowing psychology's history, we will be better prepared to understand and appreciate the psychological concepts to be covered later. We're going to start by going way back. People have been thinking about the mind for thousands of years. Many cultures throughout history spent a lot of time speculating on the nature of the mind and soul. The most prominent figures in ancient psychology are ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and his student Aristotle. They created theories attempting to explain how the mind works and what causes human behavior. Plato, for example, believed that the soul, or psyche, had three parts. The intellectual part, or logistikon, the part that focused on wants and desires, or epithumedikon, and the emotional part, or thumoides. A healthy psyche would have all three parts in balance. Aristotle built on Plato's ideas about the mind, emphasizing observation and reason as the way to acquire knowledge and understand nature. These ideas became the foundation of what we consider early psychology today. The Greeks were so influential that we took their word for soul, psyche, and made it part of the word psychology. Psychology continued to develop through the Renaissance and was heavily influenced by the work of 17th century philosopher René Descartes. Descartes believed that the mind and the body are two separate things. This is a theory called Cartesian dualism, or mind-body dualism. In dualism, the mind is an immaterial substance that is the source of your thoughts, emotions, and beliefs, while the body is a physical substance. The central claim of dualism is therefore that the immaterial mind and the material body are two distinct substances which interact to cause behavior. But how can an immaterial thing interact with a material thing? Descartes suggested that the immaterial soul resides in and influences the body from the pineal gland, a part of the brain we learned about in our study of the endocrine system. Philosophers continued to debate this idea and theorize other ways the mind could work up until the middle of the 19th century. Now, you may have noticed that we have been using the term philosopher instead of psychologist when talking about early psychology. When thinking about the mind, philosophers struggled with how to measure immaterial things like thoughts and feelings. Since we couldn't actually measure anything, early psychology was considered to be a branch of philosophy and not a science. It wasn't until we started learning how the brain actually works that we could start using the scientific method to study the mind. What we think of as psychology began in 1879 when German professor Wilhelm Wundt founded the first experimental psychology lab at the University of Leipzig, officially separating psychology from philosophy. In fact, Wundt was the first person ever to call himself a psychologist. He and those in his lab began using the scientific method to study the mind, thereby setting the stage for future psychologists. After Wundt, psychology grew into multiple schools of thought and fields of study. The earliest school of thought is known as structuralism, which was founded by Edward Titchener, a student of Wundt. Structuralists believed that all psychological processes were made of basic elements, or structures. They discovered these elements by asking research participants to describe their exact experiences as they work on mental tasks, a process known as introspection. A person reading a book, for example, might say that they are seeing some black lines on white paper. But structuralism was limited. Participants often couldn't accurately describe how they performed mental tasks. You're seeing black lines on paper when you read, but how do you get information from those lines? How do you describe the manner in which you complete a math problem? From these questions, the structuralists realized that the mind was doing things like processing information outside of our conscious awareness. This leads us to another school of thought called functionalism. Unlike the structuralists, the functionalists believed that consciousness could not be broken down into parts. They believed it was a continuous and changing mental process. Because of this view, the functionalists asked a different question than the structuralists. Instead of trying to understand how the mind works, functionalists wanted to know why the mind does certain things. Why do we have emotions? Why do we form relationships? How do human behaviors help us live in our environment? Functionalists tried to answer these questions by directly observing the human mind and human behavior. The neurologist Sigmund Freud created his own theory of psychology in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He is the founding father of psychoanalysis, which focuses on the role of unconscious thoughts, feelings, and memories in understanding behavior. Freud theorized that these unconscious thoughts and forgotten memories controlled literally everything that a person does. In Freudian psychology, the psyche is made up of three parts, much like what Plato believed in ancient Greece. To Freud, these three parts were the id, or instincts, the ego, or reality, and the superego, or morality. So the id is the part of the psyche that is full of primitive desires, sexual and aggressive drives, as well as hidden memories, while the superego is the psyche's moral conscience. The ego's job is to mediate between the other two parts. All three parts working together is what ultimately creates human behavior. Unfortunately for Freud, the id, ego, and superego are unobservable and cannot be tested scientifically, making this theory more philosophy than psychology. Very few modern psychologists fully subscribe to Freudian principles any longer, particularly his theory regarding psychosexual stages, but he was incredibly influential in the development of psychoanalysis as well as the field of psychology itself, and we will circle back to go deeper with Freud's work later in the series. It was because of him that psychologists began to study the unconscious mind and how basic motivations and desires influence behavior. Freud was also one of the first people to understand the importance of early childhood in shaping adult behavior and personality, and one of the few people of his time to willingly discuss pleasure and sexuality in a scientific context. Another school of thought arose in the early 20th century, which was called behaviorism. Unlike other schools of thought, which focused on the conscious and unconscious mind, behaviorism attempted to make psychology more scientific by only studying observable behavior. One of the earliest behaviorists was Ivan Pavlov, the physiologist who studied classical conditioning in dogs. This is something we talked about while discussing learning and memory in the biopsychology series. As we recall, he studied dogs who learned by repetition to associate a ringing bell with mealtime and would eventually salivate when they simply heard a bell in anticipation of the associated meal. Pavlov and other behaviorists thought that psychology was the study of behavior. Because you can't see or measure consciousness or the mind, you can't use it as part of your scientific study of psychology. The behaviorists were wrong about this, as we will discuss later. One can indeed study thoughts and feelings. Although behaviorism isn't a school of thought any longer, it was important in establishing how learning occurs. And focusing on observable behavior is an important part of psychology today. Starting in the 1960s, psychologists began to wonder how the brain might be involved in mental processes like perception, thinking, memory, and judgment. They still wanted to study observable behaviors, like the behaviorists, but they wanted to know what was going on inside the mind and the brain. This type of psychology, called cognitive psychology, is an active area of research today. Cognitive psychologists study things like perception, decision-making, and problem-solving, often using brain imaging tools like MRI to see what role the brain plays in these behaviors. As we can see, psychology has changed immensely from its early beginnings in philosophy with the ancient Greeks to the start of experimental psychology in Wundt's lab, and it continues to change and grow every year. Unlike psychologists of the past, today's psychologists do not necessarily identify with a particular school of thought, like functionalism, structuralism, or behaviorism. Modern psychologists instead typically have a particular field of research that they focus on, like the cognitive psychologists we mentioned before. Other fields include developmental psychology, which looks at how the mind changes over a lifetime, and social psychology, which asks how social situations and cultures affect our behavior. Each of these fields are huge and continuing to grow. In this series, we will talk about a few main ideas from each of these fields to give you an idea of what kind of research is occurring in psychology as a whole. For now, let's move forward and talk about how psychologists actually test what the mind is doing.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.
So that was very well done, as you can see. And so let's go back. This gives you a really good foundation to think about what we are going to talk about in the rest of the lecture. So getting back to trying to get the right screen here. Here we go. So getting back to the types of psychology, right? We talked about major perspectives. The first we're going to talk about is structuralism. And that video did a really good job of placing structuralism within the history of psychology. And the idea here is that psychology should be to try to reduce everybody's experience to the basic elements, to discover the laws that govern these elements, and then to connect the elements to physiological conditions. And Edward Titchener was one of the first structuralists. And then functionalism basically argued that psychology's goal should be to study how consciousness and experience assist in adjusting to the environment, and William James was one of the first ones in this area. Evolutionary psychology tries to understand the evolutionary pressures that shape our behavior. And Gestalt psychology says that human experience is more than just the sum of its parts. You can see from this picture, is it just a sequence of hexagons, or is it one actual thing? They also look at how you think and how you perceive. So John Watson was one of the earliest behaviorists, and he argued that psychology's goal should be to study just what we can actually see, directly observable behavior, and to try to understand how things in the external environment produce our behavior. And the focus here is on the associations between the environmental events and behavior. And they do what they call behavioral analysis, which is an approach to the study of learning where they focus on the laws and processes of behavior across different species. The video spent a lot of time talking about Sigmund Freud. This is a good picture of him. And he came up with the psychodynamic theory, where he argued that our psychological experience is the product of conflict between our id, our ego, and our superego. And he had a really big influence on the role of the unconscious. Humanistic psychology believe that the goal of psychology is to understand human strengths and aspirations. And positive psychology is the subfield of psychology that tries to understand the strengths and virtues and values of human behavior. So we'll take a break now here and go back to another video that talks about some of the beginnings of psychology.
That dream about the dinosaur and the leotard, those times that you said that thing that you know you shouldn't have said, or even that thing you didn't even know you were gonna say. The little cogs of your consciousness cranking away, making your life possible, making society function, all of the things that you're so glad you can do, and all the ones you wish you could stop doing. Excluding other human minds, your mind is the most complicated piece of the universe that humans currently know about. The rules that govern it are mysterious and elusive. Maybe our brains just aren't complex enough to understand themselves, but that's not going to stop us from trying. The word psychology comes from the Latin for the study of the soul, and while its formal definition has evolved over the last several decades, today we can safely call it the science of behavior and mental processes. The term psychology wasn't coined until around the turn of the 16th century, and a practice that we would actually call science today wasn't established until the mid-1800s. But of course, humans have always been curious about themselves and what's going on up here. Aristotle Freud pondered the seat of human consciousness and decided that it was in the heart, not the head, being, as we have seen quite a lot here on Crash Course, absolutely and completely wrong. 2,000 years ago, Chinese rulers conducted the world's first psychological exams requiring public officials to take personality and intelligence tests, and in the late 800s, Persian Dr. Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, also known as Razis, was one of the first to describe mental illness and even treated patients in what was essentially a very early psych ward in his Baghdad hospital. From the efforts of those early thinkers up until today, the field of psychology has been all about tackling some of the big questions. How can humans do horrible things like commit genocide and torture other humans, and how come we know those things are horrible? Do we have free will, or are we simply driven by our environment, biology, and non-conscious influences? What is mental illness, and what can we do about it? And what is consciousness, or the notion of self? If I lose my awareness of myself, am I still human? I don't know! But over the next 6 months, these are the questions that we're going to be exploring together. How our brains work, how they can break, how they can be healed, why we behave the way we do even when we don't want to, and what it means to be thinking and feeling and alive. When hearing the word psychology, most people probably think of a therapist listening to a patient unpacking the details of his day while reclining on a couch. Maybe that therapist is wearing glasses, chewing on a cigar, stroking his whiskered chin. Admit it, if you're thinking about psychology, you're probably picturing Freud. Sigmund Freud was one of the most tremendously influential and controversial thinkers of his time, maybe of all time. His theories helped build our views on childhood, personality, dreams, and sexuality, and his work fueled a legacy of both support and opposition. His life was long and spanned an important swath of history from the American Civil War to World War II. But like most great scientists, Freud developed his revolutionary ideas by building on the work of others. And of course, innovation in the field didn't stop with him. In truth, psychology is one of the most wildly diverse sciences in terms of the questions it proposes, the methods it applies, and the different schools of thought and disciplines it contains. Perhaps more than any other science, psychology is just a big old integrated melting pot. For instance, right around Freud's time, there were a lot of different schools of thought about how the study of the human mind should be tackled. Mainly, there were the ideas of structuralism, functionalism, and psychoanalysis. Scientific psychology got its start in 1879 in Germany when physician Wilhelm Wundt set up the first psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig just a few years after publishing his Principles of Physiological Psychology, considered the first true psychology textbook. Wundt and his student Edward Bradford Titchener took cues from chemists and physicists and argued that if those people could break down all matter into simple elements or structures, why couldn't they do the same for the brain? They tried to understand the structures of consciousness by getting patients to look inward, asking them how they felt when they watched a sunset or smelled a coffee or licked a kitten or whatever. Titchener named this approach structuralism, but despite its rigid-sounding name, it really relied so much on introspection that it became too subjective. I mean, you make sense and feel something different than I do, even if we lick the same kitten. Psychologists, of course, can't actually observe a patient's inner thoughts or feelings, so ultimately the structuralist school of thought was fairly short-lived. By contrast, American physician and philosopher William James proposed a different set of questions focusing on why we think and feel and smell and lick or whatever. Basically, he focused on the function of behavior. This approach, functionalism, was inspired by Charles Darwin's idea that adaptive behaviors are conserved throughout the evolutionary process. James published his seminal book, The Principles of Psychology, in 1890, defining psychology as the science of mental life, just as Freud was starting to flex his big brain. Sigmund Freud began his medical career at a Viennese hospital, but in 1886, he started his own practice specializing in nervous disorders. During this time, Freud witnessed his colleague Joseph Breuer treat a patient called Anna O with a new talking cure. Basically, it just let her talk about her symptoms. The more she talked and pulled up traumatic memories, the more her symptoms were reduced. It was a breakthrough, and it changed Freud forever. From then on, Freud encouraged his patients to talk freely about whatever came to mind, to free associate. This technique provided the basis for his career and an entire branch of psychology. In 1900, 1900, he published his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, where he introduced his theory of psychoanalysis. Now, you probably think of psychoanalysis as a treatment, the whole patient on the couch scenario, and that's definitely part of it. But Freud's concept was actually a lot more complex than that, and it was revolutionary. The radical kernel of psychoanalysis was the theory that our personalities are shaped by unconscious motives. Basically, Freud suggested that we're all profoundly affected by mental processes that we're not even aware of. Now that sounds almost obvious to us now, but part of the genius of Freud's theory was that in 1900, it wasn't obvious at all. The idea that our minds could be driven by something that our minds themselves didn't know about was hard to grasp. As hard as, maybe organisms evolving by natural selection. It was abstract, invisible, and there was something about it that seemed irrational. But the other important part of Freud's theory was that the subconscious, literally the thing below consciousness, was still discoverable. Even though you weren't aware of it, you could come to understand it through a therapeutic technique that used dreams, projections, and free association to root out repressed feelings and gain self-insight. So what Freud was really saying was that mental disorders could be healed through talk therapy and self-discovery. And this was a really big breakthrough, because prior to this, people with mental illnesses would be confined to sanatoriums and at best given menial labor to do, and at worst, shackled to a bed frame. After the interpretation of dreams, Freud went on to publish over 20 more books and countless papers with an iconic cigar in hand all the while. He believed smoking helped him think, but it also helped him get jaw cancer. During the last 16 years of his life, he underwent at least 30 painful operations while continuing to smoke. By the late 1930s, the Nazis had taken over Austria, and Freud and his Jewish family narrowly escaped to England. By September 1939, the pain in his cancerous jaw was too great, and a doctor friend assisted him in suicide through morphine injection. He was 83. Whether you love him or hate him, and make no mistake, plenty of people vehemently disagreed with him, there is no question that Freud's impact on psychology was monumental. While competing theories in the young field of psychology either fell away or evolved into something else, psychoanalysis remains an important concept and practice today. The next big shakeup rolled in during the first half of the 20th century when behaviorism gained a higher profile. Heavy hitters like Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and B.F. Skinner were key players here. They focused on the study of observable behavior. You may remember Skinner as the dude who put rats and pigeons and babies in boxes and conditioned them to perform certain behaviors. Right around when Freud escaped to England, Skinner published his Behavior of Organisms, ushering in the era of behaviorism, which remained all the rage well into the 1960s. The other major force at the time was, of course, Freud's psychoanalysis and its many descendants collectively known as the psychodynamic theories. These focused on the importance of early experiences in shaping the unconsciousness and how that process affects our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and personalities. By the mid-20th century, other major forces in psychology were also brewing. Schools we'll explore later in this course, including humanist psychology, which focuses on nurturing personal growth, cognitive science, and neuroscience, all of which contributed their own unique takes on the study of mind. Today's formal definition of psychology, the study of behavior and mental processes, is a nice amalgamation that pulls from all these different schools of thought. It recognizes the need for observing and recording behavior, whether that's screaming, crying, or playing air saxophone to an imaginary audience, but it also gives credit to our mental processes, what we think and feel and believe while we're tearing it up on our invisible instruments. Because again, the point that I really want you to take home is that psychology is an integrative science. Yes, folks still get grumpy and disagree plenty, but the essence of the discipline has everything to do with creating different ways of asking interesting questions and attempting to answer them through all kinds of data gathering methods. The human mind is complicated. There is no single way to effectively crack it open. It must be pried at from all sides. Harvard astronomer Owen Gingerich has gazed into the distant horizons of space, and even he has acknowledged that the human brain is by far the most complex physical object known to us in the entire cosmos. And we all get to have one of our very own, just knocking around right up in here. We here at Crash Course are really excited to spend the next several months delving into the world of psychology, how it applies to our lives, our minds, and our hearts, and how it deepens our understanding of each other, our world, and ourselves. Thanks for watching this first lesson in Crash Course Psychology, and I'd like to especially thank all of our Subbable subscribers, without whom we would literally not be able to do this. Would you like a personalized signed Crash Course Chemistry periodic table, or even to see yourself animated in one of our episodes? To find out about these and other perks, go to subbable.com/crashcourse. And thanks to our crew. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale and edited by Blake DiPastino. Our psychology consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor was Michael Aranda, who is also our sound designer.
So I believe that he talked about the psychosocial cultural perspective, and basically, it's looking at many different areas of psychology and how they work together to influence our behavior. So the next thing is from the textbook, and it starts talking about crisis management, and this guy, Dr. Stith, is the CEO and Executive Director of the Aurora Mental Health Center, which is in Ontario, and he just talks about how they combine security, emergency management, mental health support, and public safety as another sort of subfield of crisis psychology. So the subfields are biopsychology, which is the psychology of intelligence, sensation and perception, which is biopsychology, sensation and perception, developmental psychology, behavioral analysis, cognitive psychology, and then these other ones are, again, further subfields: psychology of intelligence, which is part of cognitive psychology, personality psychology, psychopathology, social psychology, and multicultural and diversity. So going forward, these, in terms of biopsychology, how the physical systems produce behavior, sensation and perception, which is how the senses collect energy from the environment and then process this information. Developmental psychology, how the individual changes physically and cognitively and emotionally over our lifespan. Behavioral analysis, how behavior changes over time. Cognitive psychology, how psychological information is processed and stored. The psychology of intelligence, how individuals differ in their mental capacities and abilities. Personality psychology, how consistent patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving exist between and within individuals. Psychopathology, how psychological problems develop and impact life and are treated. Social psychology, how the social environment, including individuals and groups, influence the individual's behavior, including how they act and think. Multicultural and diversity studies is a subfield that explores how culture and ethnicity and sexual orientation, gender and disability influence us, and cuts across some of the traditional subfields, which strongly represents the growing integration within psychology. Whoops, sorry about that. Let me go back there. That was by mistake. So we start with William Wundt, or also known as Wilhelm Wundt, and he was basically considered to be the father of experimental psychology. He's from Leipzig, Germany, and in 1874 he did the first psychology textbook. And his focus was on what he called the Zeitgeist. And if you've never heard of this, Geist is kind of ghost, and Zeit is life. And then it's basically the idea that, we have this idea of a soul. And this one is kind of the one that dominates the theory of psychology as we go forward. John Stuart Mill, who was really known to be a philosopher, very interested in how we thought, and he kind of set the stage for the development of psychology through his arguments for the scientific process to be applied to human behavior, and his ideas from chemistry and psychological exploration. Charles Darwin, who I'm sure you've all heard of, came out with a very famous book called The Origin of Species in 1859. And he talked about natural selection, and he was the one who kind of first argued publicly that we actually came from animals and not from God directly. And he was the first one who talked about this idea of dualism, the fact that humans are a combination of physical and non-physical components. And so the reality is, as was mentioned in the Crash Course Psychology video, that psychology actually goes way back. The origins, of course, they don't know exactly for sure where it came from, but there's some suggestion to say that it goes back to at least before Christ, to the Greeks and Persians and Chinese. And the psychological philosophy was actually in some of the ancient traditions and religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. So although we talk about psychology from the perspective of our culture, the idea here is to recognize that it actually goes way back in ways that we don't even understand. But William Wundt in the Western tradition would certainly be considered one of the founders. And he argued that we should rely on the science and psychology and stick to observable, replicable measurements of behavior and mental events. William James, who is also mentioned in both videos, I believe, he was considered to be the father of American psychology, and he came up with the first American textbook in 1890. And this is just from the desk of this guy who is the CEO of Aurora Mental Health. And these are just questions you can consider from your textbook. So Carl Stumpf and Oscar Sphinx came out with Clever Hands, and you could read about how that happens in your textbook. Then psychology leaves the laboratory in the development of industrial and organizational psychology, also with organizational development. And these are basically areas that look at the applications of psychology to work and change in the workplace, and tries to figure out how we can improve workers in factories and how we can improve their position. This is just about the recruiting, very famous recruiting Uncle Sam in the United States, and the psychology that went behind that, and that psychology has been also used to develop these SAT tests as an offshoot of the personality tests. In terms of what we do as psychologists, well, you can see here that a lot of people work in mental health, 24%, or health services. 17% work in areas that are not specified. Sorry, education and training. 4% in areas that are not specified. 18% work in educational services, and then 15% work in management. And that's essentially it for this chapter. Hopefully that makes all sense to you.